This is episode 289 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Well, Wally, and viewers especially, you might see that it's a little bit different in terms of our setup because I am traveling with the family on vacation here. Went out to Monterey, California to visit family, and am in Kingman, Arizona right now. So little bit different environments here, but hope you're doing well, Wally.
Yeah, you too, Paul. So how was the trip? And I know Kingman, Arizona, you're halfway there about back to Albuquerque. So
halfway back. Yeah, it was a good trip. Monterey is a beautiful part of California. A lot of great history there. Went to Easter church on Sunday at a very old Spanish church that had been there since 1795, and just a really unique place. Of course, they get that cool temperature effect, which I know Albuquerque's been a little on the warm side here recently, but yeah, it's a beautiful place, and I'll probably try to post some pictures up on the blog. You know, of course, in these days, we've talked a lot about COVID and different policies between the states. I'm sure most people are aware that California, a deeply blue state, is a lot like New Mexico in terms of being locked down, but it's a different flavor of lockdown, Wally. It's a lot different in some ways than Albuquerque or New Mexico in general. Obviously, New Mexico is doing the whole turquoise, red, yellow, green thing, so that gives you different flavors across the state of New Mexico, but definitely a different impression here in California.
So Paul, what do you think? What is the biggest kind of feeling difference that you got being in California compared to the time you've spent in New Mexico and Albuquerque, you know, ostensibly under our yellow condition here? So,
well, my understanding, of course, talking to family who have been living there in California, it had been very, very locked down, probably more so than New Mexico up until a few weeks ago. They didn't have indoor or even outdoor dining at all. Of course, if you're Gavin Newsom, the governor, you could go to the French Laundry, but average restaurants, my understanding is, weren't open at all, indoor, outdoor, whatever you ask, for up until a few weeks ago here in California. That may have differed somewhat by county. One of the things about New Mexico is that you don't have a lot of natural crowd-oriented places. You know, the Santa Fe Plaza, when all the stores are going on, when things are really active in Santa Fe. But Santa Cruz, California has a pier. They have amusement park kind of, you know, at the pier there. That was bustling on the day we went. Of course, it was Holy Week. A lot of people are out for spring break on vacation. They have much more overt threats of fines for not wearing masks, even outdoors walking around, whether it's in Monterey or on the pier in Santa Cruz. We went to beaches though, and the beaches were relatively mask-free. You saw an occasional person wearing masks, but you know, we don't have, outside of some of these events, you don't have that many places where large congregations of New Mexicans are happening on a regular basis, unlike, say, at a beach or in a tourist area like Monterey. And the other thing is, movie theaters are open here, which is kind of different. Obviously, movie theaters in yellow parts of the state are not open. I don't remember if green is movie theater go time or if it's just turquoise, because I know Santa Fe, at least one of their theaters have opened up in Santa Fe. And of course, we traveled, you know, through Arizona. I'm kind of disappointed, and this is something that I think is going to be an interesting development over time. We're staying in hotels. We stayed in one in California on the way. We stayed in one here, obviously in Kingman. Now, a lot of businesses in Arizona, despite the governor lifting their mask mandate and removing restrictions, private businesses are still requiring some of those masks and those kinds of things. And it'll be interesting to see, corporations can be just as risk averse as any government, especially big corporations that face liability issues. So it'll be interesting to see how that situation develops for some of these businesses over time, if they're able to, kind of go that extra mile and require those masks when that's not a government requirement or not. I think it's still pretty early here, obviously in Arizona and even in Texas and some other places. It'll be interesting to watch how that unfolds.
Yeah, even the great one, Dr. Fauci, said that he thought by 2022 we wouldn't need masks. So, it's one of those. Now, Dr. Fauci's certainly probably going to change his mind 6 times before anything would come to pass. But the point is even somebody like him who's been just shall I say, coin a term, the mascaroni, if you will. He really loves the mask here recently. Even he's saying there will come a time that it's not necessary. And, I don't know, in New Mexico and everywhere, really, vaccinations are pressing onward. And I think that there will come a time when maybe even those risk averse corporations are going to face some pushback from people not wanting to wear masks going into their stores.
I'm confident that they already are getting at least some pushback, and it does put employees in a tough spot, and I respect that. But I also believe that the only way to get these businesses to kind of dial things back, they're not going to easily, just like governments, they're not going to easily dial back on some of these requirements, because in a lot of these corporations, the real power is the attorneys, and the attorneys, they figure, well, whatever's the safest thing we can do, we can say, well, let's keep the masks going, keep those in place because of safety. Well, customers are also going to have a say, and certain customers are going to push back. And I can also, getting back to California, tell you that, Monterey, it's Fisherman's Wharf, it's the pier, a lot of John Steinbeck-y kind of stuff going on there, Cannery Row, etc. Mask usage outdoors there was rather limited, even though there were $100 fines allegedly. I tended to not wear my mask outdoors walking around. I kind of have a principled position against wearing masks in the outdoors. Yes, there were more people there than you might see on a bike trail around Albuquerque, but definitely still being outside is relatively safe when it comes to the COVID-19. And, it's getting safer all the time as more people are vaccinated.
Yeah. And, it's one of those, I believe it was the New England Journal early on had an article about that masks were largely a talisman, this magical kind of symbol to the COVID gods. And people really, I don't know if it's a majority, but a vocal and believing plurality really think that it does something. So, we always talk about the science and the data. The science and data is not that clear that it's making a big difference. But yeah, I will. I personally will also be glad when the mask mandates go away, at least for outside. It's like, yeah, there's just very little justification for that in my mind right now.
No doubt about it. Yes, and I know that's a key phrase. My wife, who watches these frequently, says that I say that. But yeah, you make a very good point. So it's a reality there, and I figured it was worth giving folks a bit of an update from another lockdown state, similar in many ways to New Mexico. One other thing I didn't see is there was a lot of restaurants, like I said, they've recently opened indoors in California. There wasn't necessarily, like in New Mexico, a big issue with social distancing. It's those capacity restrictions, even at 25%, and I don't know what they are in California, are pretty easy, it seems, to comply with in most restaurants. Not that we were dining in a lot of times, but in places like Monterey, it's pretty comfortable to sit outside during the day, and it's even beautiful just to sit out at night, as it is in many places around Albuquerque. So anyway, some very similar environments, of course, some significant differences. And let's move on to another news item of the week, which of course is the Democrats now picking for Congressional District 1. That, of course, is to replace Deb Haaland, who moved up to Secretary of the Interior. A bit of an upset there, Wally, in terms of who the Democrats decided on. Antoinette Sedillo Lopez, a sitting New Mexico state senator, somebody who has seemingly deep roots, although I don't know that much about her personal story. I think she was a professor of law at the University of New Mexico, had ran against Deb Haaland for the congressional seat in a primary in Haaland's first election. So when it was an open seat, when Michelle Lujan Grisham moved up to the governor's mansion, wound up in the primary after the first rounds of balloting, or I don't know, they separated things. They did things a little differently in the Democratic Party. Sedillo Lopez looked like she was going to get the nod, and then Melanie Stansberry, a rising, if you will, second term legislator, state representative with ties to Albuquerque, born here, went to high school here, but pretty much moved up to Washington, D.C. after stints in college and out of state. She's got plenty of money, though, and she's definitely got the progressive chops, just not the, it's a very Hispanic-oriented thing nowadays with New Mexico politics. Both parties, I think, try to pick people with Hispanic surnames and backgrounds, and I was surprised that Sedillo Lopez wasn't able to pull it out, but I think maybe she's ruffled some feathers and taken some extreme positions like on fracking, and maybe that was too much for even the Democrats.
Yeah, and this is an interesting process, and the question comes up, if they actually had a primary, would the same candidates have won on both the Republican and the Democrat side? And you have to say pretty objectively, it's probably a longer shot for Melanie Stansberry to get that nomination in an election. There's a handful of party insiders, and I've not been directly on that, but I can certainly imagine the kind of horse trading and arm twisting that goes on. And it's definitely a campaign, but it's just for a handful of people. And now those handful of people in both parties are the ones that got to put forth the candidates for their party. And now the voters actually do get to decide. So it will be interesting. And, it's interesting that Stansberry, she's been a rep now. She's been, I believe it was Jimmy Hall she defeated when he was the incumbent, and then she has won re-election for a second term. Definitely part of the progressive wave here in New Mexico, and the I don't know what we call it. I don't want to call them endangered, but threatened species status of greater Albuquerque senators for sure, and increasingly representatives there in Santa Fe. And so she's definitely a big part of that. And I don't think there's any question that either one of the Democrats there, Sedillo, Lopez, or Stansberry, would be very progressive, very likely to carry on the progressive direction in the House of Representatives. And, you know, the House is a little different than the Senate. There's not room for necessarily a statesman outside of the mainstream of the party to have any impact in the House of Representatives in Washington. So, you know, the biggest import, I think, is over the long term is that which party in the House will have the majority and gets to be the speaker and calls all the shots. You know, I've heard many representatives over the years say that one of the kind of most frustrating, futile, lonely jobs in the world is to be a member of the House of Representatives in Washington in the minority party.
True, although both parties are so close these days in terms of their numbers in Washington that these kind of seats, even though this is definitely a Democrat leaning or even moving into the Democrat dominated side of the ledger, it's a seat that I know both sides in Washington really, Republicans are hoping to flip, Democrats are desperately trying to keep, and there's implications for a lot of things, including, of course, redistricting in New Mexico and the future of those congressional districts. I did want to go into a little more detail. They were Moores and Stansberry voted on several similar bills or the same bills, not just similar ones, but even though one was in the Senate, one was in the House, this session they voted on some important legislation that we've been talking about, and you can go and find out more about their votes on the Freedom Index. It probably doesn't surprise anybody that they tended to vote in opposite directions. But Rio Grande Foundation is going to be doing some voter education on these issues. Obviously, the election is June 1st, so we're under 2 months out now. SB 317, we really criticize because it's a tax increase on health insurance policies. Moores voted no, Stansberry yes. Mandatory paid sick leave, Moores no, Stansberry yes. The Sustainable Economy Task Force, SB 112, Stansberry voted yes, Moores voted no. SB 8, which is to give local governments the ability to enact restrictive air quality regulations. Moores voted no, Stansberry yes. HJR1, the Land Grant Permanent Fund for pre-K and early childhood, as well as K-12. Moores voted no, Stansberry yes. And the New Mexico Civil Rights Act, HB4, Moores voted no, Stansberry yes. These are bills that passed more than likely, either governor signed them, or in the case of Constitution, constitutional amendment, they go to the voters. And to get an idea of some of the priorities that she herself has, Stansberry introduced or co-sponsored HB 9, the Climate Solutions Act. She introduced a bill, HB 206, which would have created new utility rate tiers, kind of subsidies for supposedly low income folks in terms of their utility bills. One bill that I find this one to be shocking, even as progressive as Stansberry is, HB 214, repeal minimum wage. This is the way it's titled in the legislative website, repeal minimum wage for disabled persons. Now, that sounds like you're repealing the minimum wage for disabled people, which is not the case. New Mexico has a lower than whatever, right now it's $10.50. I don't know what the rate is, but for disabled people and for high school students, there was a minimum wage in place. I don't know, there was a bill on high school students to raise it up to the usual level of everybody else. Same with disabled people, which is going to inevitably result in more unemployment for disabled people, because if you can find somebody who's able to do 100% of the job 100% of the time, you might not be willing to pay the same rate for somebody who has certain developmental issues or whatever those issues may be. I think that one could be something that provides a little bit of context to Stansbury's real views and just, I think, blatant misunderstanding of politics, quite frankly.
Yeah, and that is one. And I remember I was pretty closely involved when they were working on the minimum wage, where they put those provisions in for people with disabilities, and it was the organizations that employed them and the people themselves were the ones that were saying, yeah, that's probably not a good idea to force them into a full minimum wage that everyone else is subject to, because I think they know, it's a bit of a trite saying, but it really is true. The real minimum wage is zero, because if the government fiat wage is beyond what makes sense economically for a business or even a nonprofit that employs people, then that job just will not be created. That person will not be hired.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think Moores gets, he's pretty conservative on most issues. He's actually kind of libertarian leaning in some ways, as much as you can be in the New Mexico legislature. The one vote we really don't like that he took in recent memory is the Energy Transition Act, which unfortunately all Albuquerque area Republicans took in 2019. Of course, Stansbury is not just she wouldn't even consider that a tough vote. That was a shoo-in vote. So, if there's going to be Republican fracturing over Mark Moores, it's just about personality or some other issue. Stansbury, as you alluded to at the outset, she checks all the boxes from the progressive far left wing of the Democratic Party playbook. And one of the interesting things about Stansbury is how little is really known about her. Like I said, she left the Albuquerque area. She went to college at St. Mary's in California, which we're recording this as the national championship game in college basketball happens. But the St. Mary's is one of those schools that punches above their weight in college basketball. It's also a very fancy private school, getting close to 50 grand a year nowadays. I'm sure it was less when Stansbury went there, and I don't know what scholarships she received or anything. And she went to Cornell for graduate school. Mark Moores, of course, played football at UNM. So very different approach there. I think, it really illustrates the dynamic we have now of the silver spoon effect going, it's traditionally supposedly been on the right, now definitely on the left. And Stansbury, she's 41 years old. We know she went to high school in Albuquerque, but she has active Twitter account. She has an active social media presence, but you don't see pictures of her with husband, boyfriend, girlfriend, significant other, children, any of that stuff. She seems like somebody who has pretty much dedicated her life to politics, working in the Obama administration, the Office of Management and Budget, really a political figure who's proven, one of the reasons she was able to beat Jimmy Hall. She took a district that had been, Jimmy Hall is a pretty conservative representative representing the Heights of Albuquerque, and took that seat not just from R to D, but kind of conservative R to very, very progressive Democrat. And she got a lot of national money from groups like Emily's List and others to do that. And she's definitely got that ability to bring in the big bucks from out of state. So definitely an interesting race shaping up here in CD1. And of course, the election is June the 1st.
Yeah. And then, I think this is a theme that we are starting to see, and that is that there's certain candidates, and you don't have to go back too far in New Mexico history to they used to maybe call them carpetbaggers, but maybe that's probably, I don't think that necessarily applies to her, but those, it's almost like they're national Democrats first, and then they find places for them to go. And I think this looks a little bit like that to me. Also, that happened with, Governor Richardson. He certainly was in a situation where I don't know if he found New Mexico more than New Mexico found him. Let's put it that way. And so we'll see what happens. But as you said, these numbers count. Whether you are a D or an R, even nominally, is huge, and will be huge in the upcoming election, the midterm elections in Washington, to see whether the Nancy Pelosi majority in the House can be eliminated by the Republicans, or at least taken into. And then the final thought I had on this is that there's certainly not a Trump versus Biden presidency. This is a single purpose election. How will the respective sides do in getting the votes out? Traditionally in New Mexico, and just basically because of the registration numbers, all things being equal, the higher the level of turnout, the more likely it is for the Democrat candidate to win. But in this special election, there is some precedent here in New Mexico that, a dark horse candidate can sneak up on who on paper looks like the favorite. And that's, I don't know if that will happen, but I certainly think it's a possibility in this race.
For sure. And I learned, this isn't the kind of stuff you talk about with legislators of either party until they run for office in Washington or wherever. Moore seems to have picked the opposite path, or had the opposite path from Stansbury. Apparently, he was born and raised in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., with a mother of Spanish descent. This is according to his Wikipedia page. His mom was from Española, Hispanic, and he then worked in Washington. He was chief of staff for Walter Bradley, and field rep for Congressman Steve Schiff. So he started out in Washington, D.C. with some New Mexico ties, and then wound up in the New Mexico, and now I guess he's hoping to head back to the D.C. area, but as a member of Congress.
Yeah, and then Paul, the other issue is on these elections is my perception is that Mark Moores would have quite a bit better name recognition just because he's been around, and he's been a relatively consistent spokesperson for the Republican Party when it comes to legislative matters. So whether that'll play, do you see it the same way? We've certainly seen a lot of Melanie Stansberry's name in the news recently, but I don't think she probably has the name recognition that a Mark Moores does in Greater Albuquerque.
Definitely, being in the House, being one of many Democrats there, when you are part of the majority party, you defer to leadership whether you want to or not. So you've got Brian Egolf, Peter Worth. Those guys are by definition the spokespeople for the Democratic Party in the legislature. Of course, the governor. There's a lot more oxygen, but there's a lot more oxygen being sucked up by those folks. If you listen to KKOB radio, Mark Moores was regularly on, partially because he's the only Republican in the Albuquerque area, in city of Albuquerque at least, that represents the area in the state Senate. You've got Bill Ream in the House and a few other folks, and have ties to Albuquerque or areas in Albuquerque, but Mark Moore's district is squarely in Albuquerque. And I'm sure that as we talked about last time, the fact that he has won in challenging seats in Albuquerque is something that swayed the Republican folks who are making that decision. So it'll be very interesting, and certainly starting out with higher name ID is going to help Senator Moores, given the short duration of this this campaign, if you will. And we'll see. I was hoping that back in November we might punish Governor Lujan Grisham for some of her nefarious decisions in the COVID area. Certainly Biden has done a lot to go after New Mexico's economy, although oil and gas in this district, this Albuquerque area, there's a disconnect there. We'll see. It'll be very interesting. Not to say it's a referendum on anything in particular, but certainly the way the country, the way the state, all of those are going are at play here. And speaking of the legislature, we are coming off of a special session yet again, and Governor Lujan Grisham got what she wanted. Maybe she'll sway the pot smoker votes in the June 1st election on behalf of Stansbury. And
a legislative, could we call it a legislative high coming out of Santa Fe? Legalization of cannabis. So
yeah, certainly the polling compared to a lot of the other things that the governor has done or hills that she's so proverbially died on, so to speak, cannabis legalization has pretty widespread popularity among voters, not just in CD1, but in New Mexico as a whole. I think there were definitely righteous concerns about the way this was done in a special session and Holy Week. But the fact is that as of April 1, 2022, so we've got a bit of a lag time here. Don't everybody show up at your local marijuana dispensary and demand recreational marijuana. So
unless you've been getting it in the illegal market, then it's probably going to be just as easy, if not easier, in the interim to get it there. So
yeah, so it's a year away from actually happening, but she did get, the governor did, marijuana legalized. And we didn't take a strong position one way or the other. This was largely done as a partisan issue. I think Senator Purtle out of Roswell was the only Republican. I don't know what his final vote was, but he was definitely engaged. He had his own legislation. There were some on the progressive side, some in the medical marijuana community who weren't particularly thrilled with the final contours, saying that this was too corporate, too focused on establishment players. I don't know. Like I said, like we talked about maybe 2 weeks ago, this is a legislative priority that had widespread popularity. The contours of the bill and exactly what they were taking on, there's certainly room for some concern and disconnect even among people who support marijuana legalization. But overall, I think the governor is going to definitely tout this as a win for her and a legislative success, even if she had to go to a special session and do it. And we'll see. Of course, we have other bills that are waiting to be signed. And by my account, at least reading New Mexico media and Twitter accounts and whatnot, I didn't see a lot of activity on bills being signed or not signed during the few days of the legislative session. So I think the governor will now get to work on signing and or vetoing some of the bills that are on her desk. She has some time to still do that, at least a few weeks.
yeah, absolutely. And Paul, I want to be clear that I think that I would have to say that I've been for marijuana legalization since about 1983, notwithstanding the fact that I was never have been a big imbiber of the stuff. But the thing about this law that just watching some of the debate, it's very interesting from a public policy point of view. So we're going to get to see, did they put enough regulation? Did they put too much? You know, there's a excise tax and the gross receipts tax. And is that 20% price difference going to be enough that they're just going to enable the illegal market to keep going or not? You know, and all these arguments were made at various points of the debate. And now we get to see what, now we get to see what happens. So there's also talk coming out of the session that many of the things that they left undone in that bill could be taken care of in the 30-day session that's coming up. I'm just going to say right now that my prediction is they won't touch that. They're not going to touch that bill until after it gets implemented and they see what the issues are. I could be wrong about that. It's one of those, that's the thing about prognostications, but I think they worked hard and fought hard, and the side that wanted it passed got it done. And I think they're going to have problems come up and hit them square in the face, not be hypothetical for them to make any changes to the bill they just passed. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the coming year and a half until everything is going great guns, as it will in the and I don't know, is recreational. I guess that's what it's called, the recreational, or take marijuana and use it for whatever reason you would like.
Yeah, and I was just checking on that. Actually, she only has until April the 9th. So there's a lot of bills that passed, both good and bad, that the governor needs to, quite frankly, get on the ball here and sign or act on in some way, shape, or form. So she's got, as we record this, I guess that's till the end of the week here, April the 9th. And it's going to be interesting to see what she chooses to sign and veto. And by the way, we were talking about it. I noticed that she's already signed SB 35. That is the increase in the minimum wage for secondary school students. Signed that back on March the 18th. They had a sub minimum wage of $8.50 an hour for young people in high school. Right now, with all the money that's being dumped on the economy, things looking great in the oil patch, it would seem like a lot of businesses might be pressed for workers and able to pay that $10.50 an hour, at least in metro areas and places where the economy is stronger. We'll see if that is the case when maybe we get a recession or the economy slows down or they stop printing so darn much money. But speaking of those high school kids and everybody else, it was back to school here in New Mexico for anybody who wasn't already in person. April 5th was back to school. Now, Wally, I know your kids are long out of school, maybe not long, but they're no longer involved in New Mexico's educational system. Mine, of course, have been homeschooled, and we took our spring break this week, and we're able to do that because we, that's how homeschooling works. You do spring break whenever you darn well please. Not that we weren't being educated in other respects during our trip, but I did get a call from somebody who I know whose child was back in an APS school for the first time since last March. And he said that school class sizes are half or less of where they were before COVID hit. Now I've got to believe that a lot of those are homeschool kids. A lot of those are private school kids. And then probably a lot of those, maybe a third, the other third being families who have kind of made do, figured things out. They've had a year to do it. And, they're just going to stick with the current option, whatever that may be, the virtual option, not necessarily because they don't think school is safe. There might be half of those, half of that third subgroup being people who don't think school is safe right now. But they've been doing the online thing for the better part of a year or more, and they're just going to keep going. The month and a half of school in person might be a bigger shock, might be a bigger pain than they need at this point. And so we'll just be back at it next fall. I don't know. Very interesting stuff. But any thoughts on where back to school takes us this year here on April 5th?
Well, I think that the fact that there is some high school athletics is one of the big ones. And Paul, this is something I honestly don't know the answer to, as to whether can you go to school to, play high school athletics and then do Zoom classes the rest of the time? Just how does that work? I'm not real sure. But, one of the things that you cannot play basketball, football, volleyball, or baseball on Zoom, or, there are computer game kind of New Mexico Activities Association events, but the traditional sports, you certainly have to do those in person in some way, shape, or form.
That's true. But I also know that at least, football and soccer, if you go on to the New Mexico Athletic or Activities Association, there's a lot of those sports are already moving towards championships and kind of finishing up. They had very abbreviated seasons. And, as a parent of children who don't play, and we're not old enough for high school sports, even if they played any of the sports offerings, there's a lot of those sports, the big ones, are already being completed. Now, I don't know if there's more sports to come, or if they staggered the season so that different kids could play, football and basketball or whatnot. But yeah, it's a very confusing time and a very confusing process. And I don't know the answer. I know that one of the big pushes early on was that schools were not going back into the hybrid model, and that there was a restriction against being in sports if you didn't have the hybrid model. But now that the governor said go back on the 5th, in person, full time, I would assume if you're still enrolled, you can play the sports. But that is a good question. I mean, that's charter schools, the way they work. If you live in the district and you want to send your kid to a charter school, they can still play sports for, whether it's Volcano Vista or Sandia or whatever other high school. But I don't know how that's all working with COVID. It's a very complicated, fast moving issue, but kids are back in school, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, exactly. And I know not every school was going to participate in sports. They just, for various reasons, lack of resources, or just couldn't pull together. But your point is, this is a time of transition, and the completion of this school year is going to be a haphazard affair. And we'll hopefully they'll get back in a rhythm that can be much more conducive to education later this year.
Yeah, and we have a conversation later on this week with Corey DeAngelis, who was here in Albuquerque recently, talking about changes to the education system, pluses, minuses, to what's happened politically and also just educationally in the time of COVID. But we had talked about in our conversation last week, West Virginia adopting education savings accounts, kind of the latest and greatest school choice mechanism. Kentucky has done the same thing. Kentucky, in this case, the legislature overrode a Democrat governor veto in support of education savings accounts. And I've been following news from all over the country, but it really does seem in states that have the political willpower and the numbers in the legislature, great changes are afoot in terms of the educational system. New Mexico, of course, this is one of the dogs that didn't bark, proverbially on the sidelines here. This session, we didn't have any serious conversations about school choice. There was bills introduced, but they didn't go anywhere, and really were never a threat to go anywhere. But the state of Kentucky, another state I might add that has maybe not as severe as West Virginia, but has traditionally had some educational challenges. And it'll be another good case study to watch and see how Kentucky's educational outcomes evolve while New Mexico moves with the status quo situation in education. So big news, and I hope more states, as they move to the conclusion of their legislative sessions, that they too choose choice for their students.
Yeah, definitely. We're definitely seeing lots of different approaches around the country. And, New Mexico is, they're pretty far out there when it comes to the charter school movement, but not so much above and beyond that. That's kind of where it begins and ends. So we'll see what happens. And, the reason this is important, and the reason that I know that it's so talked about, is it's not having to do with actually caring what the minutia of the rules are for public education as much as is it being effective. This is really one, is educational achievement occurring in the right numbers and for the right number of kids under the system we're doing. And so that's why this is, I think, such a really important issue for every state, and certainly in a state like New Mexico that's struggling with educational attainment. It's certainly hyper important here.
Yeah, and right before we wrap this up, a couple of loose ends. One, Wally, we talk about my own personal journey, our family's journey in education. We've got the younger two daughters all locked in for Catholic school for the fall. Just kind of had it with APS, a lot of good teachers, a lot of good people, but the system is the problem. We are looking at, for my oldest daughter, who's coming into middle school, 6th grade, mostly charter schools, and a new option, a school that had offered 7th grade now is offering 6th grade. So we'll see. We've applied for that charter school, and we're kind of figuring things out in terms of educational options there. And just a quick shout out before we go. Of course, marijuana legalization was first envisioned way back when Gary Johnson was governor of New Mexico, and certainly he's moved into a lot of different areas in politics and personal philosophy, but it is definitely worth noting that that great big ball, so to speak, that policy change really got underway here in New Mexico and really nationwide. He was the first elected official of any stature to advocate for that position, so far as I know, at least. And it is worth acknowledging Gary's role in this whole discussion and this policy debate, especially here in New Mexico, as that law will presumably, that bill will become law when the governor signs it, if she hasn't already. I know it was obviously a top priority and she will sign it, but certainly worth recognizing Gary Johnson for that leadership.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And, and he did that from at the time, a Republican governor in his 2nd term, and he certainly took a lot of heat for it. And I'm with you. If he wasn't the godfather of the legalized marijuana movement, at a state level, he was really close to it. So he was out there speaking nationally, and definitely highly identified with that as an issue. So,
all right. We'll wrap it up there for this week. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.